He didn't speak, he didn't flinch, but when one old man was in danger, he moved, and the world took notice. Before we begin, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to God Royals, where silence meets sacrifice. Stay till the end. You won't believe how a single step shattered centuries of stillness. Caleb Whittaker had never broken formation, not once in his 12 years as a royal guard at Buckingham Palace. Raised in the quiet hills of Yorkshire, he had grown up admiring photos of his grandfather in uniform, a war hero who never spoke much, but taught Caleb the meaning of dignity through quiet strength. From the age of 16, Caleb had chased the dream of joining the Queen's Guard, not for the spectacle, but for what it stood for: discipline, tradition, and respect. Every day he wore the red tunic and bearskin hat with silent pride, knowing that every second he stood still was in service to something bigger than himself. It wasn't just a job, it was a vow. No expression, no emotion, no movement unless absolutely necessary. On this particular morning, thick London fog crept low to the cobblestones, muffling the chatter of tourists near the palace gates. Children laughed, cameras clicked, street performers juggled in the distance. To the average eye, everything seemed ordinary. But Caleb's instincts were sharper than most. As he scanned the crowd, something pulled at him. A disturbance, not in sound, but in spirit. A frail elderly man had caught his eye, surrounded by younger men. Something wasn't right. Something was about to happen. And when it did, Caleb would be forced to choose. His oath or his conscience. Caleb had seen thousands of tourists over the years. Some curious, some playful, others just passing by with wide eyes and smartphones raised. But today his focus locked in on a single man. An elderly gentleman, no taller than 5.5 feet, standing alone near the black iron gates. The man's posture was fragile but proud. His suit, though time-worn, was carefully pressed. On his chest hung 3 military medals, their silver edges dulled with age but rich in history. His name, as Caleb would later learn, was Harold Everett, a 91-year-old Royal Navy veteran who had served during World War II. At first, Harold simply stood still, perhaps reminiscing, or maybe honoring something only he could see. Then came the shift. A group of 3 young men, no older than 20, closed in with arrogant smirks and taunting eyes. Their tone was mocking. One of them pointed to the medals and chuckled. "Bet you bought those off eBay, Grandpa." The words stung even from a distance. Harold didn't flinch. He looked the boy dead in the eyes and replied, "I earned every one." But it didn't stop there. Another teen reached out, fingertips grazing one of the medals, tugging it slightly. It wasn't just disrespect. It was provocation. Caleb felt it in his gut. That pull. That tightening in the chest that signals something's about to go wrong. His training told him to stay still, to remain the stoic emblem of tradition. But his heart, the one that beat for his grandfather, for every soldier buried without a name, was already moving. The chill in the air sharpened as Caleb's eyes tracked the interaction. From a distance he appeared emotionless, as he'd been trained, but inside a storm was building. One wrong move from those boys and something sacred would be broken. And then it happened. The leader of the trio, a lanky teen with a puffed chest and a cheap laugh, grabbed the largest medal on Harold's chest and yanked. The old man stumbled back a half step, catching his balance with his cane. His face didn't show fear, just profound disappointment. That medal wasn't just metal. It was a story, a memory, a piece of himself, and someone had torn it from him without understanding its weight. Gasps erupted from nearby tourists. Some raised phones, unsure if this was part of some bizarre performance, but Caleb knew better. Something ancient stirred within him, a thread of duty stronger than silence. In one fluid motion, he broke formation. The ceremonial stillness shattered with the crisp sound of his boot against the stone. The movement, rare and nearly forbidden, echoed like a cannon through the courtyard. Heads turned, phones locked on him. As he approached, his voice, measured and low, cut through the crowd. The teens froze, startled. The leader scoffed, trying to mask fear with bravado. Only the toy soldier speaks. But Caleb's expression didn't change. His blue-gray eyes bore into them unflinching. Tourists began whispering. Was this real? Was he allowed to move? Harold stood silently, his chest rising and falling with quiet dignity. The leader smirked and took a step closer to Caleb. Or what? That was the moment Caleb's body acted faster than thought. With practiced precision, he seized the young man's wrist, twisting it just enough to elicit a cry and make him drop the medal. It fell with a soft clink onto the stones. Caleb didn't yell, he didn't break posture. He simply leaned in and said, "You will leave, now." The boy staggered back, rubbing his wrist. His tough guy exterior was gone. "This isn't over," he muttered. Caleb replied with silence. The crowd didn't stay silent, though. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then growing. People clapped not for spectacle, but for principle. Harold reached down and picked up the medal, his fingers trembling as he brushed it off and repinned it to his chest. He looked up at Caleb, eyes glassy. "You didn't have to do that, son." Caleb stood straight, his voice steady. "Yes, sir, I did." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. In that moment, he wasn't just a guard, he was a bridge between generations, between tradition and humanity. And as the crowd recorded every second, the world outside the palace gates was about to witness a rare truth. Sometimes silence must be broken to protect what matters most. By the time Caleb returned to his post, the square was abuzz. The guards at Buckingham Palace were not supposed to move, speak, or acknowledge anything beyond their ceremonial role. Tourists knew this, locals respected it, and yet there stood Caleb Whitaker, now the center of a digital wildfire. The video footage, just under 90 seconds, was already spreading like flames on dry brush. Onlookers had posted it across social media with captions like, "Royal Guard breaks ranks to defend a veteran." The silence finally spoke. Discipline meets heart. Within hours, morning shows picked up the story. News anchors debated the implications, callers rang into radio stations praising Caleb as a hero or questioning the breach of protocol. On one side stood the weight of tradition. On the other stood moral courage. Caleb stayed silent through it all. His uniform didn't come with a microphone, it came with restraint. But behind the stone-faced stillness, his thoughts swirled. He'd always believed that loyalty was about never stepping out of line, but as he watched the world react, he started to wonder. What if true loyalty meant standing up when it mattered most? In the barracks, whispers followed him like shadows. Some fellow guards clapped him on the back in passing, muttering, "Well done, mate." Others stayed quiet, avoiding his gaze. At night he sat alone, polishing his boots longer than needed. He thought of his grandfather, of how he once told him, "Sometimes the hardest rules to follow are the ones written in your own heart." Outside the palace walls, veterans groups began organizing letters of support. One retired American colonel even sent Caleb a message. "Son, if you were mine, I'd salute you. We need more guards like you, and fewer who hide behind rules." But not everyone agreed. A few officials within the royal household raised concerns. If one guard could move without consequence, would others follow? Could centuries of tradition unravel from one act of defiance? An emergency review board was scheduled. Caleb was called in, no longer just a symbol, but now a man with questions to answer. He stood in front of a panel of high-ranking officers, their faces unreadable. "You knowingly violated standing protocol?" one asked. "Yes, sir," Caleb answered firmly. And if you had the chance again? He didn't hesitate. I'd do it again. And I'd do it for any man who wore the uniform with honor. There was a long pause. Then the chair of the panel, an older man with weathered eyes, leaned forward. Then maybe it's not the man who needs to change, but the protocol. That night, Caleb returned to his quarters under quiet observation. No punishment, no praise. Just a shift, not in policy, but in perspective. And for the first time, he realized that his step out of line hadn't weakened the uniform. It had humanized it. For days, the uncertainty hung in the air like the thick London fog. Caleb showed up for duty as always, posture perfect, uniform immaculate, expression unreadable. But something had changed, not just in the eyes of the tourists, who now looked at him with reverence, but in his own heart. He had stepped out of line, yes, but he had also stepped into something bigger than rules, into the space where courage and conscience meet. The official review had ended without punishment, but also without resolution. No public reprimand, no commendation either, just silence from the palace. Until one evening, the sun was setting, casting long gold shadows across the courtyard stones. Caleb was in the barracks, removing his gloves, when a knock echoed at the heavy door. It was Harold Everett, the same man whose medal had been torn from his chest, now stood tall despite the cane in his hand. His frame was still slight, but his eyes held the weight of someone who had seen war and lived with its echoes. "Evening, son," Harold said with a soft smile. "Vigor, I owed you more than a thank you." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small cream-colored envelope, sealed with the royal crest. Caleb blinked. "Is this—" "I was invited to tea by someone high up," Harold said, voice hushed but amused. "I told them about you. Told them the palace needs men who know when to stand still and when to step forward." Caleb opened the envelope carefully. His hands, usually rock-steady, trembled slightly as he unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was formal, elegant. It wasn't a reprimand. It was a commendation, a quiet recognition, not just of service, but of character. "Your actions on date reflect the highest traditions of the Guard and the moral compass of our institution. Let it be known that courage need not always be still." Caleb was speechless. His heart swelled, not from pride, but from clarity. For the first time in his career, he understood the full spectrum of duty. It wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about fear of breaking rank. It was about knowing when to move and why. Carl, still holding the envelope's flap, reached once more into his coat and pulled out a faded patch. Frayed at the edges, embroidered with a crest. "This belonged to my brother," he said. "He didn't make it home from the Ardennes. I kept it close all my life, but I think you've earned it now." Caleb accepted it silently, overcome with emotion. "You protected me," Harold continued, "but more than that, you reminded everyone watching what those medals really mean." As Harold turned to leave, his cane tapped rhythmically against the stones. Caleb watched him go, feeling the weight of the patch in his palm, heavier than any weapon he'd ever held. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new kind of duty, one rooted not just in discipline, but in humanity. He wasn't just part of the Guard anymore. He was part of something greater. In the days that followed, Caleb Whitaker carried the faded military patch in his inner breast pocket, close to his heart, under the layers of red wool and polished brass. No one could see it, but it became his anchor, a private reminder of the moment everything changed. He still stood guard, still wore the same uniform, still upheld the unyielding tradition of the Royal Guard, but he was no longer the same man. Before, he had believed that honor came only from discipline, from never flinching, never reacting, never questioning. That was how he was trained. That was how hundreds before him had served. And in many ways, that was how the world saw the Royal Guard: stoic, silent, untouchable. Now, when tourists passed by, they looked at Caleb a little longer, not out of curiosity, but out of respect. Some nodded, others whispered. Veterans from around the world sent letters to the palace, referencing him by name. A few elderly couples came just to see the guard who moved for something greater. And among his fellow guards, the conversations were quieter, more thoughtful. At first, there were sidelong glances, hesitation. Tradition doesn't shift easily. But slowly, walls began to crack. Not with rebellion, but with reflection. One night, after parade drills, a younger guard named Thomas sat beside Caleb on the barrack steps. His voice barely rose above a whisper. My granddad fought in the Falklands. I never knew how to connect with him till I saw what you did. Caleb didn't reply right away. He just nodded, his eyes fixed on the moonlit cobblestones. It wasn't about fame. Caleb never once responded to an interview request. He refused to make a spectacle of what, to him, was simply doing the right thing. But internally, his idea of service had transformed. He now saw that tradition, real tradition, wasn't about blind obedience. It was about carrying values forward, not just the ritual of standing still, but the courage to act when stillness becomes silence. This realization reshaped how he stood his post. He still didn't move. He still didn't speak. But he saw more, felt more. Not just threats or disruptions, but people. The stories they carried. The weight behind the eyes of an old veteran. The pride in the faces of immigrant families pointing at him, explaining to their children what honor looks like. His posture didn't just represent British history anymore. It represented something universal, the quiet strength to stand, and the wisdom to know when not to. Behind the gates, the brass buttons, and the rules, Caleb had discovered the humanity that made those traditions matter in the first place. And for the first time, he didn't feel trapped in his duty. He felt empowered by it, because when you carry the past, protect the present, and honor what is right, even when it's difficult, you're not just a guard. You're a guardian. And in the quiet hours of the morning, when the city hadn't yet woken, and the flag above the palace fluttered against a pale sky, Caleb stood taller than ever, not because he had to, but because he chose to. The morning air was crisp, with a soft golden hue stretching across the palace courtyard. For most, it was just another changing of the guard, the same ceremonial rhythm, same polished boots, same unbroken silence. But for those who had followed the story, those who knew what Caleb Whitaker had done, this morning carried more weight. It had been 3 weeks since that day. 3 weeks since he'd stepped out of formation to defend a man others had chosen to ignore. 3 weeks since the internet had crowned him the silent protector. The world hadn't forgotten. In fact, it had grown louder. American and British veterans groups had begun collaborating, using Caleb's story to reignite conversations about respect for the elderly, forgotten soldiers, and what it really means to serve. One retired U.S. Marine wrote, "I've saluted presidents and generals, but I'd be proud to salute you, Caleb. You reminded the world what honor looks like in a uniform." Letters poured in. Caleb read only a few. He didn't do this for attention. But the messages from older viewers stuck with him the most. One woman in Florida wrote, "My husband served in Korea. He passed 10 years ago. Watching your video made me cry. For the first time in years, I felt like someone remembered men like him." Caleb folded that letter and tucked it next to Harold's patch in his locker. But nothing prepared him for what happened next. At a private veterans gala, Caleb was invited as a silent guest. He wore his full uniform, stoic as always. He expected a polite thank you and maybe a handshake or two. Instead, the entire ballroom rose to their feet as he entered. Not one word had to be spoken. In that room stood heroes from wars long past, men and women who had seen the worst of humanity and still carried themselves with dignity. They weren't applauding a breach of protocol. They were honoring the reminder Caleb gave the world. That duty isn't just about standing still, it's about standing up. The Royal Guard had never been part of political statements or modern causes, and yet somehow his act, quiet, firm, compassionate, had transcended headlines. That night, a young girl, maybe 9 years old, approached Caleb with her father. She looked up at him with wide, sincere eyes. "Are you the God who helped the grandpa?" He knelt slightly, lowering his gaze to hers. "Yes, I am." She handed him a small, folded piece of paper. Crayon scribbles of a man in a tall hat standing next to a smiling old man. "You're my hero," she whispered. It wasn't the medals, it wasn't the recognition, it wasn't even the gala. It was that moment, a small child understanding what millions of adults had debated. Caleb returned to duty the next day, same place, same stance. But everyone who walked past now saw something more. A man who dared to care. He had become a symbol, not just of British tradition, but of universal conscience. Not just of royal protocol, but of human kindness. And while the rules hadn't changed, perhaps hearts had. Because in every crowd from then on, someone whispered his name. Someone told his story. Someone pointed and said, "That's him, the one who didn't just guard the palace. He guarded something far greater, our values." Imagine this. You're in uniform, silent, stoic, trained not to move no matter what. Hundreds of tourists watch you every minute, cameras recording, rules unbending. Your job is to stand still, to be the symbol of unwavering discipline. And then you see it. An elderly veteran, alone, his medals, earned through pain, blood, and sacrifice, are mocked. A young punk reaches out and tears one from his chest. It isn't just rude, it's disgraceful. Do you move? Do you risk your career? Break centuries of protocol? Become a viral spectacle? Or do you stay silent, frozen, and let disrespect go unchecked? That was the choice Caleb Whitaker faced. And in the quietest moment of his career, he moved. What do we learn from this? That courage doesn't always come with loud declarations. Sometimes it's a step forward, a hand raised, a quiet defense of someone who can no longer defend themselves. For those of you watching, especially our older viewers who know what honor once meant on the battlefield or at the dinner table, this story isn't just about a royal guard. It's about you. About the values you've carried through decades, about the silent courage you've shown in life's hardest moments. Caleb reminded the world that sometimes doing the right thing means going against the grain, and sometimes the cost of silence is far greater than the risk of action. What would you do? Let's talk about it in the comments. If you were in Caleb's shoes, how would you have handled the moment? Have you ever had to choose between following rules and doing what's right? Do you believe tradition should bend when morality calls? We want to hear your thoughts. Your rating matters. On a scale from 1 to 10, how powerful was Caleb's story for you? Drop your rating below and share why it moved you. If this story inspired you, even just a little, don't let it disappear. Like this video to show support for standing up for what's right. Subscribe to Guard Royals for more true stories of silent heroes. Share it with someone who needs to hear this today, especially a veteran, a grandparent, or someone who has always lived by honor. Because stories like Caleb's aren't just told, they're remembered.